Okay. I know a lot more people are coming, but I think we should start, and they'll just have to catch up as they enter. I think we have a critical mass to begin, and you never know what goes on in people's screens. Okay, I'm B. Ruby Rich, and I want to welcome you to the Film Quarterly webinar, the FQ webinar. And we've been doing these for a year now, a little more than a year, ever since lockdown and the never-ending pandemic got us to stop a lot of the live events, all the live events. And we actually became so fond of the webinars and people were so enthusiastic that even though the film world is creeping back into presence, into live presence, we've decided to continue them. And so today we're going to be talking with the writers from this new issue of Film Quarterly in the special focus on rethinking binge watching in the age of COVID-19. And this has been an incredibly exciting section to work on. And I think that it particularly invites your participation as we go on through the course of this 90 minutes. The way that we organize these is that the first half hour involves the panelists speaking to some of their current concerns based on their articles, the parts they especially still feel attached to, the parts they most want you to hear about, and in some cases updates since these were filed originally probably something like more than 6 months ago. And then in the second half hour, I like to have them get the chance to talk to each other, to be a bit more impromptu, and I think especially with these pieces, to update them, to think about what this current moment is like and what is still true and what is shifting. And then in the last half hour, we start looking at the questions that you've asked, either in the Q&A or posted in the chat, and you're welcome to do either one throughout the session. And that's always some of the most fun, always some of the parts that are most fruitful and most energizing. So we do not do long introductions. Your time is too precious, but their CVs are too precious to leave out. And so we put them into the chat as each person speaks. And today we will be starting with Netta Alexander introducing the special focus in the session, and then go to Tanya Horek, who's going to be speaking, followed by Tina Kendall, then Kartik Nair, and then Netta will be back with her own contribution, after which we will open it up. And you will see more about each panelist as they speak. So just keep an eye on the chat. And feel free to have crosstalk in the chat whenever you have a response to anything, because for me at least, that's one of the most enlivening aspects of doing this. We welcome that. We don't have cameras on you, but we keep the chat open and the Q&A open, and we absolutely want to hear from you. So don't feel you're interrupting us or being rude, chatting to each other about points that develop over the course of this hour and a half. So let me get started and not hold things up too much. This is the Film Quarterly webinar beginning. And as you get excited and want to recommend it to friends who are not here, keep in mind that you can go to the Film Quarterly website, which is simply filmquarterly.org. Click on the video tab in the menu. And by next week, this will be up there. And all the past webinars are there as well. And they're available in whatever the internet's version of Forever is for you to use, look at, share with classes, and so on. So this conversation will live on. Now, Netta, do you want to get us started with an introduction to how this came about and what this subject really is? I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Ruby, for organizing this, for helping us getting this special focus in order. And I also want to thank Mark and Rebecca and the entire Film Quarterly editorial team. This was such a really fantastic experience to work with everyone. And of course, my partners in crime, Tanya, Tina, and Kartik, to thank you. So, so the idea for this special focus was born, as Ruby just mentioned, a few months ago during the pandemic. I've been teaching binge watching for a few years, and I've been trying to teach binge watching through two essays. One is a 2018 essay by Tanya, Tina, and Mareike Jenner, called 9 Critical Propositions on Binge Watching, which I think is doing a really wonderful work, and it's a conversation starter with all of my students, helping us think of binge watching as a mode of self-determined viewing. So it's all about agency. So it's less about the question of how many episodes are considered to be binging and so on. And it's more about the question of control and the tension between agency and choice and randomness on streaming services. And also, of course, the introduction of the drop release model, so releasing an entire season on one day rather than the linear television and broadcasting, traditional broadcasting model. And the other essay is an essay by Elena Pilepets from 2018 as well, in which she talks about the 3 Ps. So she talks about plentitude, participation, and personalization. So the 3 Ps. And of course, I read it in the beginning, in the first lockdown, and I'm thinking, well, what about the 4th P, which is the pandemic, right? And so I thought, how can we update some of the existing theories and associate them not just with excessive consumption, addiction, regret, shame, and other negative connotations, but start to think about them as a civic duty, as a survival mode, as the one thing that really helped millions of people all over the world to survive the lockdowns and the very, very scary first month of the COVID pandemic. Since the issue was edited and published, I actually came up with a 5th P. So forgive me for using so many Ps, but the 5th one is play something. And play something is a relatively new feature that Netflix introduced into their interface, I believe just a few months ago. So after we already sent that to the press, but play something is this idea that you have decision fatigue and you go over Netflix and you have nothing to watch. And so instead you just do what you would normally do on Spotify when you click shuffle, and you would say, tell me what I will need to watch, right? So play something is this randomness, introducing randomness into this interface of supposedly endless choice. And to me, it was a fascinating moment because I thought, if traditionally television scholars talk about the tension between flow and segmentation, and some scholar, famously Jane Foyer, said that the way to negotiate this tension is by thinking of liveness and the premise of linear television as the premise of liveness. So I started thinking, well, how can we theorize a new tension between choice and randomness, and what would be the alternative to liveness within the age of binging during the pandemic and so on. So these are some of the questions that I want to open up the discussion with. Ruby, I think you're muted.
Yes, I am. Thanks so much. I appreciate that update and setting. And we're going to start now. I'd like to begin with Tanya Horek speaking to us and not just about Netflix and Heal, but also self-care and all the ways in which Netflix and related streaming have evolved. So Tanya.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruby. It's great to be here. The only thing that I love more than binge watching is talking about binge watching. So it's an honor to be able to do so in such esteemed company. Thank you. So while scholars might debate definitions of binge watching, and some of them take issue with the term itself, there's no denying its cultural currency. And my interest is in the kinds of claims that are made for binge watching as the most dominant and certainly like the most talked about mode of televisual consumption in 21st century media culture. And a lot of claims have been made for binge watching over the last 10 years. It's been seen as a guilty pleasure, something that's quite naughty, or at least not very nourishing. It's also been seen as a viewing habit that's potentially dangerous for your health. It's been seen as something that can even kill you. However, with the global pandemic, there was a notable shift in how binge watching was talked about in the public domain. And so in my piece for Film Quarterly, Netflix and Heal, I was really interested in exploring how binge watching was recast as the best form of medicine during the pandemic. So reports emerged saying that watching TV in lockdown can be good for you. And the internet lit up with recommendations of TV shows that were particularly well suited to boosting positive emotions. And at this time, of course, Netflix is right at the center of all of this. And it emerged as a kind of healing machine, or this like vision of Netflix as a kind of healing machine took hold. Now, it's important to note that comfort TV, the idea of comfort TV, TV that consoles and hugs you, is not exactly new. However, the idea of kind TV took on a different kind of import in the midst of this growing worldwide death toll and the grim conditions of social isolation. So that's when we start to see shows such as Schitt's Creek, and then later on in lockdown, Ted Lasso, coming to the fore. And these shows appealed not only for their gentle, easy viewing qualities, but also, I would argue, for the strong vision of care that they had at the center of their narratives. And as Jason Sudeikis recently joked on Saturday Night Live, he was surprised at Ted Lasso's massive success because it's about two things Americans hate: soccer and kindness. But jokes aside, it seems clear that there's a link between the cruelty of the pandemic and this trend for kind TV. The pandemic, of course, made existing social inequities painfully apparent around healthcare and social welfare, and really brought to the fore like the profound lack of care in neoliberal societies. And so I think it's little surprise to discover the lockdown responsiveness to TV shows that served as quarantine heart salves through a construction of these more caring and equitable worlds. But TV viewing during the global lockdowns wasn't only about kind TV, and we have to grapple with Tiger King, don't we? Do you remember Tiger King? At the very beginning of quarantine, this was a series that brought people together, but it brought them together to rubberneck at the lives of cultural others. So there was a therapeutic, but really ethically dubious value in extracting scenes from Tiger King and turning them into memes, because that's what people did. They watched Tiger King, they WhatsApped their friends, they thought it was hilarious, and they cracked jokes about lockdown life during the pandemic using these scenes from Tiger King. But what I was intrigued, yes, and there's a striking example of one of the memes that I'm talking about. But as lockdown continued, we moved on from Tiger King, and different, more political meanings got attached to the activity of binge watching. And I was quite intrigued by this shift. So the racist police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th was a turning point. It was watched in horror by the world. We were all at lockdown, we were all at home, lockdown, watched this collective viewing of this horrific event. And in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests that followed, binge watching was recast in public discourse as this activity with the power to ignite social and political activism. And I was just intrigued at how these lockdown conditions and the synchronicity of collective viewing appeared to create this space for a reframing of binge watching as a politically productive activity, one tied to social justice projects. And around this time, you also have these listicles emerging of like TV shows and films that you should watch, of anti-racist films and TV shows that people should watch to immerse themselves in as a means of converting them from unreflective couch potatoes into socially enlightened citizens. Now, these lists were very problematic and overly simplistic, as scholars have noted, but COVID culture's repositioning of binge watching as a civic duty, I still think is interesting because it compels reflection on how viewing habits in the streaming era might be related to public pedagogy around social justice struggles. And this is a question that continues to remain really intriguing for me. How might the kinds of narratives designed for binge watching, along with the effective experiences of watching television in compressed form, relate to social progressiveness? And how might it not? So Michaela Cole, for example, the creator of I May Destroy You, which was a major lockdown hit, has spoken of her distaste for binge watching and has said that people need time to digest episodes and to process challenging material, for example. So there's not really any simple answers to these questions, but I think this continues to be an interesting area of exploration. So just to conclude, where do we find ourselves now? In some ways, it feels like we've come full circle. Tiger King 2 is premiering on November 17th. Ted Lasso has just finished its second series, and a new season of Succession is out, albeit on a weekly release schedule that frustrates binge-watching inclinations. And as we slowly return to the routines of work and socializing, the experience of binge watching might not be as intense as it was when we were totally locked down. But if binge watching remains culturally relevant, and I believe that it does, it's because it captures something, I think, about the effective intensities of internet TV and user-directed / algorithmic viewing, which can be capitalized on by streaming platforms such as Netflix, and also by social media platforms such as TikTok, which Tina, I believe, will now discuss.
Thank you. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you.
And yes, indeed, please welcome Tina Kendall, who wrote for Film Quarterly really fascinatingly about scrolling and TikTok and the ways in which these platforms are being used or forcing us to use them. So Tina, over to you.
Thank you so much. What a great segue. And yeah, like my fellow panelists, I just want to thank everybody for letting me into this great conversation. So in my contribution to the special focus, I was really interested in thinking about how the discursive construction of televisual binging as a form of self-care and as a form of civic duty, perhaps, dialogues with other sort of networked media forms and practices that were sort of coexisting in that same moment. So in the title to my piece, I allude to a conceptual shift from binge watching to binge scrolling, and suggest that like binge watching, binge scrolling was also tethered during the pandemic to the collective effort to stay home, stay connected, and stay safe during the pandemic. So my focus really of interest was on TikTok, which was, as most of you probably know, the most downloaded mobile social media app of the entire pandemic. One frequently hailed as, quote, the perfect medium for the splintered attention spans of lockdown. And it dovetailed in very interesting ways with the public conversations that people were having around what it means to binge watch, and featured binge watching quite frequently through the TikToks that were made. So in my piece, I was really interested in thinking about how TikTok entered into this sort of context and sought to address what I refer to as the pandemic's bored body problem, by which I mean not just the issue of what to do with ourselves when we're, trapped in our homes, but also the wider problem, well, I should say some of us were trapped in our homes, but also the wider problem posed by any given human person's threshold for sustained attentive engagement, which emerges from contexts of binging more generally. So I suggest that TikTok managed to position itself as really an ideal tool to address pandemic malaise and this housebound condition of boredom by very purposely tapping into the paradigm of binge watching and the televisual binge model, while repurposing them to deal with this new situation. So by framing the user as both a performative player and a always vigilant spectator, I argue in the piece that TikTok offered a means of releasing the cramped stuckness of sheltering in place into the rhythms and flows of contagious mimetic participation. And I conclude in the piece that as a concept and a practice, binging, therefore, can be seen to operate across a wide spectrum of media forms and practices. So it encompasses different speeds and rhythms of engagement, and represents one way of managing the bored body problem, and interfacing and sort of retemporalizing our experience of time during lockdown. And here I just want to conclude by opening up a few reflections that I had subsequent to writing the piece that really spring from this framing of binging in the context of networked media. So what tensions or contradictions emerge when we start to think about social media engagement through the rubric of binge watching? And I've just got three kind of tensions that I think come to the fore when social media is framed through that way. And the first is relates to spectatorship. So social media users are predominantly, I suggest in my piece, social media viewers. And social media platforms actively capitalize on the user as a spectator, despite the way that these platforms position themselves constantly in relation to the figure of the creator and pitch themselves as outlets for creativity and personal expression. This point may seem obvious, but I think it's one worth emphasizing, because a lot of the scholarship on TikTok tends to highlight the more performative aspects of content creation, but the pleasures of browsing are still vital to the platform's success because so-called lurkers outnumber active content creators still by a wide margin. So platforms like TikTok, have managed to kind of like wade into this, this context and address boredom by potentializing the scroll as a set of scripted actions that might or might not propel the bored body into action, thereby reproducing tensions between passive and active viewing that were always at the heart of earlier forms of spectatorship. Tension two, time. So social media formats such as TikTok succeed in their conquest to drive engagement by privileging limited snackable time structures, which paradoxically eat up more time overall. And one widely cited report by App Annie from July 2021 suggested that, and this is a misleading headline, but I'll read it out, people spend more time on TikTok than on YouTube and Netflix. We can talk about why that's misleading maybe in the chat, but the stats that are provided, they say average TikTok usage in the US is 24 hours on TikTok and 26 in the UK, compared with 17.5 and 12 on YouTube. So what this suggests, I think, is that, and as I suggest in my piece, social media companies like TikTok have very purposely been sort of seeking to repurpose televisual flow and have tapped directly into discourses around binging in a way of kind of attracting customers, and part of this involves an effort to kind of up the ante on the supposed endlessness of choice that platforms like Netflix have by sort of contrasting the infinite feed or the endless scroll as truly infinite in contrast. And in this move, the fear of exhausting one's binge-worthy shows or completing Netflix, as one popular pandemic-based meme had it, is replaced by a fear of missing something from the never-ending stream. And this fear leads to a phenomenon that was popularized during the pandemic of doom scrolling, and was also tethered to a sense of social duty, a need to stay informed and to react to events in real time as they happen. And then finally, to wrap up, tension three has to do with space. So although TikTok is a mobile app and as such intended to fill in moments of micro boredom while out and about on the move, or so we thought before the pandemic, it's come into its own in the context when many people were, in their homes, sheltering in place. So binge scrolling condenses a particular paradox around mobile media that Larissa Hjorth and Ingrid Richardson write in their book, Ambient Play, that while mobile media allow us to remain entertained while unattached and on the move, they also tether us to a sense of being at home. And so in this way, binge scrolling during the pandemic embodies the paradox of an immobile mobile media, and trains us to the investment that so-called on-the-go media platforms have long had in domesticity and a condition of being bored in the house, to evoke Curtis Roach's viral pandemic TikTok. So in conclusion, I think restating some of these unresolved tensions that emerge when we consider binging from a transmedia perspective helps to remind us of these fuzzy distinctions that have always existed between different forms of viewership between older and newer media. Therefore, these issues shouldn't be considered in a silo, but scholarship on intensified digital media use can greatly benefit from the history of research into film and television spectatorship, as well as Netta suggested in her intro. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much, Tina. Now moving to a very specific case. I want to welcome Kartik Nair onto the focused camera and hear from you, Kartik, about friends and labor and the risks of certain kinds of spectatorship. So over to you.
Thank you, Ruby, and thank you for inviting us to speak today on the subject of binge viewing. My interest in binge viewing, quite specifically, was to do with a lawsuit I heard about a few years ago when Canal Productions, the New York-based film production company, sued one of its former employees, Chase Robinson, for allegedly binge viewing Friends during work hours. And the lawsuit, which is publicly available, details quite specifically the number of hours that were spent viewing Friends, including an epic binge of 6 seasons of Friends in just a matter of a few days during work hours. And then by comparing charges, Canal claimed, they could see that she was ordering food off Caviar and doing Uber rides and things like that. And all of these details led them to charge her with binging, loafing, and theft of time, which they estimated to be worth millions of dollars. And initially, my interest in the lawsuit was, how did they quantify the number of hours spent binge viewing Friends? What is this thing that they were calling theft of time? How did they know that 125 episodes of Friends were watched by Chase Robinson, right? What's interesting is it seems like they were just using the metric or the activity log that Netflix makes available to all its users that lists the day on which an episode of a TV show or a film is accessed, and using that to tally that it was 125 hours. So they were using a Netflix methodology, which only a few years ago was switched over, that named any act of choosing to watch anything on Netflix for 2 minutes as an act of watching the whole text, right? There are no specific details offered in the lawsuit of the hours of the day when Chase was watching these episodes of Friends or the location from which the show was accessed. And Netflix was quite open about this change in its methodology. Open, relatively speaking, it's in a footnote in one of their shareholder letters. But what was interesting for me then was to think about how Canal Productions was mobilizing this methodology in order to paint Robinson as an unproductive worker. And it made clear to me that the metric of how many hours were spent watching Friends was not meant to stand on its own, right? But was meant to help paint a portrait of somebody who was, ordering food off Caviar, not working, taking Uber rides, $600 lunches at one point are alleged. So a portrait of a young woman who is undisciplined, antisocial, unproductive, and vampiric even, right? And that's when she was sued for binging, loafing, and theft of time. Those are the terms from the lawsuit itself. Now, what I discovered in some of my research was that loafing is a very specific class-based and racialized name for a certain kind of unexploited industrial labor time. It's often a bodily practice in space rendered as public nuisance. In the United States, loafing was criminalized by the Vagrancy Act of 1865, one of the so-called Black laws, which sought to curtail the kind of free time of formerly enslaved people. So by terming her use of time loafing, Canal was kind of spectrally racializing a highly compensated white woman's labor, right? And in that process, trying to criminalize it. In a countersuit, Robinson alleged that she never binge-watched Friends at work, and in fact, the Canal is a workplace rife with harassment, right? And she offers up her own lawsuit, which I encourage you to check out online. It's extremely painful to read. What she says, though, is that she sometimes used the company account to watch Friends at home while she was falling asleep, and she describes the show on Netflix as white noise for her, right? And now the white noise of Friends may have offered Robinson something else, so the meaning of that Friends binge changes. This now is solace from a toxic workplace, right? This offers a kind of vision of social cohesion, all attained by men and women who are conspicuously, infamously absconding from the workplace. So the soundtrack to which Robinson must have been falling asleep every night convened not only her past familiarity with the show, but something akin to an entire residual formation of broadcast television and its audiences, right? A kind of people history to watch over her while she sleeps, which I think is beautifully imagized in that shot from Friends of All of Them looking over a baby's crib. And so my interest finally transformed into the question, not how did Canal measure binge, but is it still a binge if you're asleep? Right? As it prepared her for another day of work, Robinson's what I might call binge sleep stream was generating value for Netflix, for the showrunners, for the Star's residual contracts, and for Canal, because it was ultimately preparing Robinson for another day to go back and work at a horrible sounding workplace. In these and other ways, her binge is undistinguishable from any other binge we've been talking about today, right? And it would be tracked by Netflix as one, even if she wasn't awake for it. You know, Tina was talking about binge scrolling. I think the limit case might be binge sleeping, right? It relocates the binge now from the viewer who binges to the platform that can binge cast, right? And so binge casting then might become a kind of affordance of the platform. And I think I'll stop there. We can touch on some of these issues in Q&A.
Great, thank you, Kartik. Thanks so much. Now, please welcome the convener of this section and webinar, Netta Alexander. Netta, I leave the floor, the screen to you.
Thank you. I'm going to try and keep it very short, but even now, just listening to all of these fantastic short talks, it made me realize how all of these essays focus on the individual binge watcher. And one thing I was trying to do in my essay, which is an attempt to update the 9 critical propositions on binge watching, so to update that to our pandemic lives. And one way to do that is to not think of the binge watching as an individual spectatorial mode, but rather as a communal activity. So what does it mean that during the pandemic, the explosion of co-watching apps such as Netflix Party, Sling, House Party, even Zoom, what we're using right now. So thinking about that as pretty much the only means to synchronize our schedules with that of our loved ones, who in many cases, in my case personally, because I'm an immigrant, are many, many miles away or on the other side of the ocean. So the ability to synchronize ourselves, which is more similar to the linear broadcasting model of cable television than what we normally associate with binge watching, which is to binge alone in the office when you're supposed to be walking, or to do doom scrolling on TikTok late at night. So what happens when we open it up and theorize it as a familial and communal activity, and then staying within the intersection of interface design and storytelling, my other intervention or contribution in the essay with really following the interface and looking at Netflix's decision to add a playback speed feature to the interface. They originally tried to do that in 2018 before the pandemic. However, many famous Hollywood filmmakers such as Judd Apatow, David Fincher, Seth Rogen, and many more said Netflix, and this is a direct citation from Judd Apatow Twitter, it said Netflix do not use the F word, so do not mess up with our timing. We give you nice things. We put a lot of work and effort into the aesthetic and the editing and the soundtrack of our work. And so Netflix decided to shelve that feature, and then it came back from the dead during the pandemic on August 2020 as an accessibility feature. So this time around, Netflix say we are adding this feature to the interface because our blind subscribers are used to listening to audio, to audiobooks and to podcasts twice as fast. And our hard of hearing and deaf subscribers need to be able to slow down so they could read the closed captions. So it will be easier for them to read the closed caption. Once they reframe this as an accessibility feature, of course, all the famous Hollywood filmmakers decided to keep their mouths shut. And so we now all have that option in the setting. And I thought it was really fascinating. It is also connected to the work of Jonathan Stern and Mara Mills about the history of disability activism and universal design in relation to media consumption, because that all started with blind students in the 1950s who were very bored by listening to very slow early audiobooks. So to me, it was really interesting to think out all those different modes that we associate with the super user or productivity tools. How can we compress? How can we watch the entire show in one weekend? But in fact, we owe an historical debt to those disabled users who were trying to hack their phonograph records back in the 1950s. So I think I'm going to leave it there. The other points I'm making in the essay, but I am inviting all of you to read the entire issue, because as you can tell, there's so many different thoughts and intervention in the issue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Netta. And you've been very disciplined. We'll have to give you more time to extrapolate from that. But in this section of the session, I want to just open up a time for the panelists to speak with each other. And I'd like to start this by saying, is all of this still true from your perspective? What has changed now that we think we are out of lockdown, at least temporarily, depending which location each of you is in? And is that changing things, or is everything still the same? Has there been a shift across these months of suspended or accelerated pandemic time, or has there not? And I don't know which of you would like to say something, but I'm extremely curious to hear what your current thinking is. Yeah, Netta, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I can say that yes, I think this is why it's always very difficult to theorize a fast-moving target, such as streaming services or social media or TikTok. If you ask any of us, I think we can all agree that by the time it is published, already these services have been going through major changes. So there's that challenge. But yes, absolutely. I think that the combination of decision fatigue and Zoom fatigue, so very real screen fatigue. We've been spending, when I say we, I mean, you know, everyone who was forced into remote work and working from home have been spending too much time in front of a screen. And so many of us feel a nostalgic yearning to off-screen activities, which makes binge watching less appealing than it was in the very first lockdown and even in 2020. And to circle back to what I said in the beginning about play something and the need to introduce randomness into our choices, it's basically Netflix telling its subscriber, look, we know you're tired. You're so tired that even if we recommend all of the things that you are likely to enjoy in the future based on your past choices, you still might be too exhausted to even make that choice. So just press this button and we're going to play whatever, just trust us, it's going to be fine, right? So I think this decision fatigue and screen fatigue are changing the way we need to think about the kind of pleasures, the unique pleasures that are still possible to us through binging.
Great. Yeah. That's a great answer. Who else wants to weigh in on that? Yeah, Tanya?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cultural discourse around binge watching has quieted down a bit at the moment. And it's interesting how we're waiting every week to watch Succession. We have to wait for the next episode. But yeah, I mean, Netflix is still going strong. Binge watching is still a thing, obviously. Although I was intrigued to hear what Tina was telling me earlier, Tina, about how TikTok, maybe you could tell us about that, about how TikTok capitalized that on this concept of binge watching during the COVID. But what's happened now? Like, is it still referring to binge watching?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. No. Tina?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was really interested in the piece that I wrote was how TikTok very strategically piggybacked on the popularity of binge watching during the pandemic and used it to sort of to advertise some of its key trends. Right at the tail end of the first global sort of lockdown period in May, June, and July, used the term trends to binge, where it had never used that term before. And, you know, I was interested in the emergence there and elsewhere of this real kind of like either still nascent concept, I think, of a social media binge, or maybe it was a brief and ephemeral concept. I don't know. But it suddenly sort of popped up in that context. And what TikTok was doing, of course, was not only kind of like trying to compete with, streaming services like Netflix and others, and sort of encourage more people to come away by saying, oh, look, you know, you can binge things here as well. It also briefly introduced a couple of live stream. It basically like introduced a live stream element that never existed before, which was tethered to all sort of discursively on the way that the platform sort of promoted this, tethered to the aim of keeping each other safe, promoting well-being. So it was using this discourse of kind of like, and being all in it together. So it was using all this discourse of like civic duty, well-being, streaming, you know, binging for your health, for your mental health, basically, is what it was, is what it was suggesting. And now, of course, I think, you know, this echoes what Netta and Tanya are saying, that like now there's a much more widespread sense of exhaustion and like screen, you know, like we're just over living our lives through our screens, many of us, or at least we say we are, because the numbers don't seem to bear this out. But and as a result, TikTok is now pivoting back the other way, and it's scrubbed any mention of, you know, excessive or protracted screen engagement from its communications, and it's now, you know, following the kind of pendulum back towards like thinking about like needing to limit screen time. So it's introducing, you know, all of these helpful measures and controls that you can use in order to limit your screen time, you know, so it's swung completely back the other way now.
Wow. Kartik, I wonder, you know, are you still obsessed with this case? Are there other cases like it? Has it gone anywhere, or have you moved on to other subjects? Where are you at with this now?
So the lawsuits are still ongoing, and it's quite, some of it can feel pretty arcane to me. I don't always understand what's going on, but they're ongoing. Other things have changed in the meantime. I mean, we were all, watching Netflix in our workplace during the lockdown, I mean, because we were all working from home. But I think the other thing that's happened is, you know, Friends has gone off Netflix. But what's interesting is I think Netflix learned something very valuable from the way in which Friends was being used on its platform. And that's this other way in which value can be generated for Netflix. It's re-bingeability or something like that we might call it. It's the second time around on the familiar text. So while bingeability seems to emphasize kind of the endless play next, this is play next because I know what's coming, right? So there's a kind of ingestible quality here that's different from some of the gustatory metaphors that circulate around binging, which is you eat it once and it's out. This is you eat it once, it's out, and then you eat it again. So there's a slightly different relationship here. And I think, Netflix might have learned that it's the cheapest white noise machine people can buy. I mean, I was using Netflix exclusively for years to watch Friends. Yeah, and so that was my initial draw to the case. I think other things have changed. It's preparing us all, though, for our days of labor. So.
Yeah, Netta, go ahead. You're muted though. So
just to follow up on Kartik's remark, they just released Seinfeld. Netflix just released Seinfeld, and I think the idea of re-binging is important to an ever-changing mediascape, because as they re-release Seinfeld now, we have so many podcasts. So suddenly a recommendation on my podcast app for Seinfeld podcasts, the episodes are still the same. There are no new seasons to the show, but now we have that. And that also connects to something that I think we as media scholars need to pay more attention to, which is this tension between the explosion of audio content and binge watching. So if I talked about decision fatigue or screen fatigue, how does the explosion of the podcast industry ties into that? and whether people see audio as the thing they can do when their eyes are too tired to binge. So instead, I'm going to binge listen to an entire podcast, to serial, or which we have more and more serialized podcasts as well. So I think there's also something to be said about the rise of the audioscape in the industry in relation to binging.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think. Oh, sorry.
No, go on.
No, I was just going to say, I think the issue of the interface and the device is really interesting. Like Tina thinks I'm mad, but I've been telling her that I'm so like fatigued and so tired, and my comfort at night is to get under the duvet with my iPhone and binge watch on that as a device and fall asleep to that. So it kind of ties in with what you were saying too.
Well, it's interesting. I think location is still really important. So the question of whether it's under your duvet or whether you're in an automobile, which was so much the driver of, for instance, public radio for many, many years when people used to be commuting, across Los Angeles or wherever. These are very, very relevant. And some of this existed even before binging. I mean, what was comfort? For the mothers in the 1950s, it was watching As the World Turns soap operas in their kitchen while they ironed, or whatever. So this interfacing between the content, as they like to call it now, and the machine and the location, these are not irrelevant, nor are gender or race. So I wonder, I think there's a universalizing of the experience that sometimes goes on that may not be true in households with, competing uses and constricted spaces. And so there's that as well. We're beginning to get some really interesting questions in here. So I think I'll break my own rule and start bringing some of them into your conversation with each other. So feel free to pop back out with your own questions, all of you. But I want to start first in the Q&A. Hannah Van Buren has a question for you, Tanya. Thanking you for your work, which has inspired her own research. And she's been trying, this is very specific, she's been trying to access your recent piece, Binge Watching Rape Culture in Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt and Unbelievable. And in there, exactly. And do you have any, is it possible to find it? And do you have any thoughts on the impact of spectator survivor healing in binging series that center themes of sexual violence, and whether this capability is different if a series is viewed according to traditional broadcasting methods like Michaela Cole intended? So what do you think about this?
Oh, thanks so much, Hannah. Yeah, thank you so much, Hannah. First of all, I'm happy to share the chapter with you. So if you just email me, I can put my email in the chat if it's not already in there. I'm happy to share that with you.
Okay, good. We can do that. Mark can do that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, I mean, that's a really significant question. And I have done work on this and looked at different shows. So there's no one clear answer. Like I've looked at 13 Reasons Why. And then in that chapter, I'm looking at Unbelievable and I May Destroy You. Yeah, like Michaela Cole wanted it released on a weekly basis, as I said, because she felt that there needed to be that time to think about the trauma and absorb the trauma. But then, as you say, many people do binge watch it after the fact. I'm curious to hear what your experience, because you said that you've done both. And in my research, I've noticed that a lot of people do talk about it in terms of a binge, and that they found that a powerful experience. And yeah, I think it's a really sort of complex question. Like with Unbelievable, I feel that series really used the binge watching narrative to great effect to make an argument about rape culture. I feel like it really cleverly linked the episodes and encouraged you to press play next episode. So, that first episode that showed the way you shouldn't handle or you shouldn't respond to the way you should treat a rape victim, how you shouldn't do it. And then immediately the second episode picked up from that and said, this is how it should be done. And there was a real flow to it. So I think that's a good example of a show that's using that bingeable design to make a political statement about rape culture.
Great,
so, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that. I'm working backwards down here through the chat, and Lisa funneled for a question for everyone. What role does age play in your conceptualization of binge watching scrolling or sleeping. Children and early adolescents are mass consuming content that features significant scenes of violence and sexual content, and citing especially Squid Game and Bridgerton. What impact might this have? So what about aging? I would say the other end as well. How does age have some kind of relevance here? And do you see that as something that's being taken into consideration at all, any of you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry,
go ahead.
Yeah,
No, go
on.
I mean, I was just thinking about age being a really kind of maybe undernamed dimension in how I'm even understanding my own case study, right? Because I think the woman who binge watches Friends represents this kind of cusp generation or transitional generation of one of the generations that lived in a time before binging was a kind of media norm, right? But the practices of the platforms are now putting pressure on existing media catalogs to be transformed into bingeable objects, right? And so what's really interesting in thinking about Friends or Seinfeld as being repackaged for bingeability is that there's a kind of phenomenal inscription. You were talking about sociality, right? The whole kind of sociality of a prior model of broadcast television is now phenomenally inscribed as a kind of residual formation into binging, right? And there's a kind of repackaging there. So maybe it's not necessarily the age of the viewer that I'm pointing to, but the age of television's history, right? There are kind of stages or ages in television's history that are also being remediated through the move towards binging.
Interesting. Does anyone else want to address that?
I was just going to add on to what Kartik is saying, because that was one thing that I was very interested in looking at in relation to TikTok. And you're right, like a lot of the TikToks that are specific to the pandemic that I was seeing, I mean, not all of them, but a lot of them were, addressing the need for binge watching. And, it's just interesting. And obviously the demographic with TikTok is very young, very, very young. And yet my sense is that binging is still something that they understand as something that applies to television, but they don't frequently think about the activities of what they're doing on TikTok in those same terms. So yeah, that's interesting in itself, perhaps.
Interesting. There's also a comment from our own Mark Francis that he posted up here earlier, wondering if the antidote to decision fatigue, as you were discussing, is actually good human curation. How do you see online platforms such as Criterion? Do they not allow for this kind of interaction or usage, or where do you place them, I would say, within this universe? Yeah, Netta?
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think two things. One, those more niche streaming services such as Criterion Collection, Kino Now, and so on are still incredibly niche, meaning if you compare them to the over 200 million subscribers that Netflix reported in the last quarter of 2021, then these are tiny bubbles of cinephilia. So these are not real competitors. But that also reminds me of a controversial decision that I like to teach when I teach the history of Netflix, that has to do originally when they started using human taggers, so just paying people to watch all the content on the website so they can give them micro tags, right? Either happy end, emotionally ambivalent, and so on. They were trying to keep that a secret. So they actually deny the fact that they are paying human beings to do that, because they wanted people to have the impression that the recommendations are being chosen by the all magical Wizard of Oz, which is the Netflix algorithm, right? Which is the original cinema system. They actually only turned that into a selling point and a marketing thing in 2014 after they released House of Cards. So I think this inherent tension between human curation and algorithm curation is really fascinating and deserve more attention historically as well as theoretically. So thank you for that.
That's very funny, Netta, that you're saying that they pretended it was the machine when it was actually humans. So we're almost in the land of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. Here we have a magic machine that will diagnose everything, all of your desires and needs. Yeah, Tina, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to this issue of decision fatigue, rather, because actually I'm so fascinated about this, and Netta, like the way that you framed that in your piece in the intro, so good and useful. This new tension between choice and randomness, and the one thing that bears pointing out about TikTok in particular is that the way that feed is curated is, I mean, depending on how heavily you get involved in it, it completely bypasses the need to make any decision whatsoever, because the algorithm is, an algorithm that just learns by watching what you watch, and feeds you random selections, so it's kind of like, it's such an interesting dialogue, isn't it, happening between the way that it's, a company like TikTok is learning from, the kind of self-directed algorithmic kind of like structure of Netflix, and then Netflix seems to be kind of innovating something very similar to the sort of the absolute absence of a need for choice being like the way of getting around decision fatigue, which is I think embedded in that play something feature that you're talking about. So yeah, it's just so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you for that. We're beginning to get some more wonderful questions. So thank you, all of you out there, for this engagement. So there's one from Jamie Andrews saying, great panel, practical question about what TV people did binge in lockdown, assuming that all of the original commissioning and most of the production that was watched in lockdown was actually commissioned and made before anyone knew about COVID. So therefore the content was intended for a different world entirely. And that seems different from TikTok, which was more responsive. And do you see differences then between, say, Netflix and TikTok based on that origination moment? Does anybody want to address this?
I mean, I'll just, the one thing and I know that Tina and Tanya and Lera can speak to this as well. We know that when production froze, Netflix and other streaming services went into a purchasing frenzy of existing catalogs from other countries and languages. And so maybe that's just one way to think about a lot of this content and where it's coming from. And also that shift some of the emphasis on how we receive texts from the context in which they were produced to the context in which they're received as the determining context, right? And so we have this habit now of seeing many texts that play on Netflix as COVID, perfect for pandemic texts. But it really is about the determining or overriding role of reception, which is something that television and other scholars have been pushing for a very long time.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Tina.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that, like, I can't, my mind is a little bit hazy right now, and I can't quite remember all of the titles of these, but there was a kind of like frenzy of Zoom-based television during the lockdown. Can anyone help me out here? There was that thing with
David Tennant and
yeah,
what's that called?
I know. And there was another one. There was another one that anyway, my mind is drawing a blank, but there was another one that kind of like, that was made for Netflix, that was rushed into kind of like production. So I mean, that to me was really interesting. And I think, some of them were atrocious, but some of them were really good. And I do think those, that kind of like obviously answered a real kind of like gap in the, maybe certain gaps in programming. I don't know, but it did, I think shows like that do speak to this desire that TikTok is definitely like providing access to, which is this desire from within our homes to learn, to have a real kind of like sense of connection and a sense of being in sync and experiencing things in sync with other people, which was partly, experienced through things like watch parties and the way that people binged. But yeah, I think TikTok, that's one of the main reasons why apps like TikTok were so important is that they opened a portal into individual, front rooms and private spaces.
Yeah.
Very good. And Netta, sorry. Netta, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so Tanya, did you want to?
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say two quick things. One, and I talked about with Karthik a bit. I think Karthik describes Squid Game as an endurance sport, an endurance television show, and I think there's a sense that our bandwidth to enjoy and contain very violent, very graphic television show has been, is larger now than it was during the pandemic. I think Tiger King, for example, is a very repetitive show. Like they kept going back to the same character, the same story, the same moments in time. So if you miss something, if you were brain dead, if you were too tired, don't worry. They're going to make sure that they will talk about the same thing 6 or 7 times. I think Squid Games is fictional and it follows a different logic. But I also have a question for Karthik, building on that question. There's something about the re-binging that we described earlier of, say, Friends and Seinfeld. I mean, these shows specifically made pre-streaming age are all about self-contained stories. So one of the promise is to give you a self-contained story within 25 to 30 minutes with all the jokes and all the, there's a main plot and there's a subplot, right? And there might be overarching stories within each season that has to do with the romantic relationship between the characters and so on. But normally you can just watch one episode and be very content with it. So I wonder, how do you negotiate that tension with the bingeability of these shows that were never meant to be binge, because there's so much center on the broadcast, the linear broadcast weekly release model?
I mean, I'll just say really quickly 2 things. When I was thinking of, the hyper violent content, just to go back to the previous question about Squid Games, I've heard reports from concerned parents they're not reporting to me, but I've heard them circulating about children being able to access on YouTube supercuts of the most violent moments on Squid Games. Right now, the binge is posed as the kind of problematic durationality of the show that you have to go through in order to experience those moments, right? And here, somebody's done the labor of actually watching the binge and extracting the most valuable, shall we say, or exploitable moments, right? It takes us back to the history of exploitation cinema. But the other thing I'm just thinking of, Netta, is that you're right. These are not shows that were designed in the age of binging. And yet they're being put to use. And so what I loved about the lawsuits is that they put pressure on where we define bingeability, right? And it's not necessarily a textual determinant, or if it is, it's a wider level of textual determinants than the thing that makes you want to hit, I need to see the next episode immediately to know what happens. If it's already re-bingeable, you already know at some level. We know, but we don't know, right? That kind of suspension. And it transforms, I think, the relationship. I think you're right. I think there's something to think about there about re-bingeability. It just cautions us to never offer one definition of what makes a show bingeable, and suggests that platform and use might be more important than.
Interesting. And going back in time on platforms, I just want to let people know, and you as well, that the next issue of Film Quarterly that will come out has a column by Caitlin Benson-Allett on what she calls the ennui of the scroll. And she's talking not only about Netflix, but about old-fashioned cable guides and even print guides and what kind of exhaustion they produce. So keep an eye out for that. I want to get back to the questions because we have 2 more really wonderful queries that I think will be stimulating for you. One is from Nicholas Bayer. Thanks, Nick, for being here. Thanks to everyone for these brilliant and illuminating remarks on binge watching. He says he was fascinated by Tanya's remarks on Kind TV. And he also references James Poniewozik's recent article in the New York Times on the broad shift from irony to sincerity in TV over the past 2 decades. Obviously, he hasn't looked at the new Wes Anderson. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to say that. I wonder if one might also conceive this as a form of utopianism. He says that it strikes him that so much recent TV such as Schitt's Creek, Ted Lasso, Sex Education, has a strongly utopian impulse, imagining that people could be accepting, non-toxic, emotionally intelligent, sex positive, in places and times that one wouldn't expect. So this is addressed to all the panelists. Do you have any thoughts on utopianism in relation to the pandemic and binge watching and contemporary television? And Tanya, you seem to have a thought about this. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that question. I haven't read this Connie Wozniak article, I don't think, so I must read that. But I have written on Sex Education and Schitt's Creek as utopias for Jump Cut. And I do think, yeah, there is definitely something to that, the way that they present these better worlds. Like Schitt's Creek won't depict homophobia in any form, because Dan Levy says that he just thinks that's not constructive. So it's this idea of producing a better world. And they were certainly received in that context during COVID, weren't they? Like that's part of the reason why there was such a fandom around them and people cherish them so much. So I'm sorry, Kartik, that Ted Lasso's sincerity drives you insane. Oh, and it's too kind. Is it too kind for you?
It's bogus. I think it's bogus. It's this like bumbling, I don't know. And I only made it through 3 episodes. That was enough kindness for me. So yeah, maybe I'm a sucker.
Anyone else want to respond to this? Netta, go ahead. Just unmute yourself.
Thank you, Nick, so much for that question. As always, technology always, we really live within this tension, the tension between utopia and dystopia, because in binging, there is the underlying assumption or promise of self-optimization. And I can self-optimize by skipping intro and watching it with minimum time. If I speed binge, which would be speed watching and binge watching at the same time, which is something we need to start theorizing. So if I do that, then I can watch an entire season in 4 hours rather than 8 hours. Right. So this is without even talking about the content, but then thinking about the content, I was binging and well, I'm sorry, we all have our guilty pleasures, but I was binging Sex, Love and Goop, which is the Gwyneth Paltrow show about intimacy and sexual lives. And I was thinking, okay, so if you binge that, then you'll optimize the way to learn how to optimize your sex life. Right, so supposedly this show, or even a show like Sex Education, these Netflix shows want to teach us not how to become better people, but how to become better lovers, more affectionate, more vulnerable, and so on. So I fully agree with Tanya about kind TV and the transition from irony to sincerity and to vulnerability, but it's also, it's a bit of dystopia because there is this pressure to optimize every single aspect of your life, right? From the bedroom until your physical well-being, and not to mention baking shows and so on. And I think that pressure was actually felt it was more prominent and more pronounced during the pandemic, as we were all stuck at home. So this idea that this is the time to learn Chinese, to bake sourdough, to make pasta, and to get the puppy, and I don't know, and like to adopt 2 kids, was really one of the things that if you cannot commute to work and you can't work, then here's a list of all the things that you must do right now, which also connects to Tanya's essay about the social activism and this idea of activism from the couch. So I think we're really within all of these tensions, and it's a utopia, it's a dystopia masquerading as utopia often.
Kartik, go ahead.
And can I just say that I think one of the things that drew me to the lawsuit was her reliance on this old show. So utopias of the past, right? This kind of melancholy about no future, right? A kind of this idea that the kind of future orientation of utopia, it might be misgiven, right? And that's, I felt myself watching Binging Friends a lot as I felt my present kind of not quite line up to my own ideas of what the future would have held, right? So maybe there's a different way to package utopia that's not just a future orientation, but something located in the past, right? The good old days.
Are you talking about vintage utopia? Is that what you're offering?
I like that. Vintage utopia. Yeah.
And that's like
utopias of the past.
A show like Sex Education has been criticized because it's not like it's filmed in Wales, but it's kind of looks like it's in America and it doesn't have a specific location, but that's the appeal of it.
It's literally no place.
Yeah,
like yeah.
So Mayer did a wonderful piece for us for Film Quarterly on sex education.
Yeah.
So people interested in that might want to take a look. Yeah.
I keep waiting for Netta's 2 kids to pop into the frame, 2 adopted kids.
Oh God. Well, there's a question from Patty Zimmerman that's been patiently waiting here in the queue. I want to bring that into the conversation because it takes us in a different direction. Thanks for this, Patty. Where does the concept of binge watching on platforms intersect with cinema? For example, at festivals, many would see 4+ films a day. Is that binging or is that just cinephilia? So maybe another way to pose this is to ask, what is the connection or intersection or divergence between binge watching and cinephilia? So that is out there for you to consider. Back in the days of liveness that we seem to have returned to with in-person film festivals. Any thoughts on binging versus cinephilia? Is one a bad word and one's a good word, but they're the same thing, or are they entirely different? Tina, I see you have your hand up. I'm going to let you go.
I was just going to say, this reminds me, it's a bit of a random example maybe, but Shia LaBeouf and Luke Turner and Nastya Ronko did a piece that was sort of evoking this idea where he called #AllMyMovies, where which featured a live stream camera trained on Shia LaBeouf's face. So all you could see through this live stream was Shia LaBeouf watching himself in all of his movies, like basically. So it was, and there were apparently people in the cinema together with him, and it was framed very much through the lens of cinephilia and the kind of the good kind of endurance that is associated with cinephilia. So yeah, I think there are very clear distinctions here.
Great. Yeah, Netta, you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Patty, for this question. I think I'm going to try and attempt and bring together many of I feel the conversation is, it's amazing. We're trying to cover many different topics. So I'm going to try and do some integration while answering your question. So if you think, first of all, when you go to a film festival, the assumption is that there is a human curation, to return to Mark's remark, right? It's a human curation, it's not an algorithmic curation. So that's one major difference. And then returning to Tanya and Tina's original definition of binge watching as a self-determined viewing. So the idea of agency is incredibly important to the binge watcher, me being able to watch whatever, whenever, on any device. Of course, we should know that watching whatever, whenever is the original Sony Betamax commercial from 1976. So Netflix invented nothing, but it reappropriate that idea. So this idea of agency, for example, by skipping intro. Right, so I don't have to finish a film, go to a different movie theater in the same festival, watch the trailers again, wait for the credits, then go for another film that, again, a human being decided to curate for me. That said, I think there is a common appreciation of the idea of full and complete immersion. That's one. And then second, which I personally experienced when I was a jury member at the Toronto Film Festival, I think 5 years ago, I had to watch 40 films in 10 days. And so you start to ignore your very basic biological needs because they don't give you a restaurant break and they don't give you a lunch break, right? So you just ignore them and you go through a 10-hour day watching 4 films without eating a decent meal, and of course without sleeping and so on. So when Netflix said that their competitor is sleep, not HBO, not Hulu, not Disney Plus, but sleep, Netflix is saying we are weighing a war on the body, on the human body. I think that's something that cinephiles can actually relate to easily, because cinephiles often in film festivals are really about, I have to catch all of those films. and I don't care. I'm gonna have a granola bar like in between, but I'm just not gonna listen to my body for that 1 week or 10 days and so on. So there are those commonalities between those two supposedly different modalities of viewing.
Yeah, I think there are some interesting connections. And I was thinking of the British filmmaker Carol Morley. Like, she did a lot of interesting things online, and she had like a day of her films where we all watched them all day long, and then we would take breaks to go on Twitter to talk about them together.
Oh, I wish I'd known this. I love her work. She's
I love
fantastic.
her too. She's just brilliant. And she did so much online during the pandemic. So like, she had that Friday film club, but then she also had this like all this long day of watching her films and us communing on social media together. So it was really interesting.
And yeah, it's so much about endurance. It's like cinephilia and binging are endurance sport, and also the work of Christiane McClay, The Clock, and walks that are 24-hour long. And I remember going to the MoMA at 3 a.m. so I could catch the 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. portion of The Clock. So those interesting.
I was also just thinking when I read Patty's question that for me, it pinged immediately questions of class and discrimination, right? Because there's cinephilia and then there's binge viewing, right? And yet there are distinctions between kind of the labor time of watching 4 films, right? Which is kind of good work you do if you love film. And then the work that the binge does to you, right? Which is the opposite of work. It's almost seen as the opposite of work. And some of the interest that I had in sleep came from there, because some of the sites that I study in my book project are video parlors in 1980s Bombay, where you paid a nominal fee to go in where films were played endlessly on videotape, and you slept. It was often for urban migrant workers who had no other place to sleep, right? And so there is this kind of other history of cinephilia that's much more connected to the workday, the clock, to rejuvenating you for labor, that I think has a subterranean link to questions like surrealist practices of slipping in and out of film, slipping in and out of waking. I think sleep is the big secret of cinephilia. I think more cinephiles fall asleep at movies than they'll admit to, but come out pronouncing them masterpieces. So, and I think that is, it's not paradoxical, but yeah.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that? This has been a terrific thread, and we have about 10 minutes left in this session. So anyone who's online and has a question for us, this is the last minute to get it on board. And for those of us here, I think this has been a fascinating conversation about binging versus something like a film festival, and when is one about privilege and when is one not. I think there's a hierarchy of status with these that perhaps could be addressed, as well as volition. Yeah. Netta, do you have your hand up? Did you want to?
Just one thing that happened during the pandemic, and thanks to the pandemic, is most film festivals went online.
Yes.
And so when we're talking about the privilege, and I agree with you, Karthik, absolutely. I mean, most people cannot go to film festivals, so unless they're in the town. And even then, I was just talking about it with a friend. I mean, the New York Film Festival this year, I think it was $40 per screening, right, for one ticket. And so if you want to go with a friend, that's almost $100. And that obviously most people cannot afford that. But when everything went online, then it somewhat converged the idea of cinephilia with binge watching, because most festivals, what they did is, instead of selling you a ticket for a single screening, they would sell you a streaming pass. So once you buy the streaming pass, you can watch as many. I mean, I watched several disability film festivals, and all of them rehabilities, and all of them you would just pay this one time, I think $80, something like that, and you can watch all of the films. And so they encourage you to binge watch what they have to offer without leaving your bedroom. So we also need to start thinking of film festival and reception studies, right? Outside of the framework of the red carpets, the physical encounter, and so on, and to bring that into the domestic viewing.
Yeah, that's very good point. Tanya, you want to add to that?
I just wanted to add to that I attended a few film festivals online during the pandemic that I never would have been able to. And it was a real endurance test for me, because as you say, you pay this amount and then you've got to watch all these, you feel like you have to watch as many of the films as you can. And of course you're in your home. I have the time difference to contend with, because a lot of these film festivals are in North America. I'd be in my pajamas, I'd be turning the camera off. It's just interesting to think about that convergence between like binge watching and cinephilia, and how the pandemic brought that to the fore.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And yeah, Netta, go ahead.
Yeah, just and within that, still the reminder or the attachment to liveness, because many of the festivals say you go, you watch it whenever, come back for the Q&A. The Q&A will be live, which is also a really interesting question. What we're doing right now in this webinar, we're recording it. So obviously many people who are teaching now and working and won't be able to join us are going to watch it later. So what is what remain of the promise of liveness, which was so pivotal, so central for television studies in the 80s and the 90s? What remain of that? And is that just the most recent incarnation of this idea of negotiating all of this different flow and segmentation, tension, while saying we're only going to do it once. The Q&A is only going to be on this time, and you have to clear your schedule to make it. Right? So that was also a telling choice.
Yeah. Well, it throws into question the notion of scarcity that so much used to depend on, because instead of scarcity, you have overload. And how do these two coexist? What does one have to do with the other, and where does value get assigned? So I think that's also interesting. As we're coming to a close, we've been pasting some of the articles that were referenced over here on the side. I just went to the Telluride Film Festival, my first live event, and write about it in the next issue. But I went to Sundance, much as you're describing, Tanya. I went to Sundance virtually, online. And actually, one of the things I wanted to mention is that I saw several pieces there by young filmmakers that were episodics, adapting TikTok platforms into their narratives. And so I think we're going to see not just blending of how we as audiences participate in these, but also a blending of aesthetic formats as people begin to see how these can travel between spaces. And I found that really fascinating as well. I don't know if you're seeing that or not. Yeah, Netta, go ahead.
Just to build on that, the blending, the first thing that Netflix did during the first lockdown was they commissioned short films from some of the most established filmmakers in the world, and they call it Homemade, and it's available on Netflix, and it's a collection of, I think, 12 or 15 short films. So they immediately thought, okay, we need to commission the thing for, pandemic media creator to start producing this very unique, specific content that can only be shot within one's room, because obviously all of these filmmakers were on lockdown. So a lot of drone footage, a lot of very creative ideas. And then one of the most interesting, I think, work of pandemic media is Bo Burnham. I forgot the name of the special. But Bo Burnham inside of course, Tatiana. Yes, inside. In which he is supposedly stuck in a very small space and needs to do is on editing and post-production and shooting and writing and everything. It's a one-man show, right, about feeling stuck. So so I think, that also connects to the cinephilia, who was brought into that in the very beginning, and then who are the people who made content later in the pandemic.
Does anyone want to add to that? Because there were a lot of people doing this. I mean, I was constantly scrolling through different platforms, looking for this kind of work and finding wonderful pieces done. I mean,
it's something, sorry to make melancholy again, but it makes me think about how, so insofar as, those homemade films that Netta was talking about index the moment of the pandemic, right? So somebody in the future consulting that can see that imprinted, let's say, in the form. It's also making me think that, Netta was talking about this will be recorded and people can watch this session. but it may also not be watched by a lot of people. And in that sense, Netflix is becoming also an archive of a mode of production where there'll be a whole host of shows that are relatively unbinged. They've been made, they've been put up on the platform, they're just waiting to be watched. And they're not unwatchable, they're just unwatched, right? And so it's making me think that, and I think a lot of scholars are already doing this work, we need these modifiers, insofar as binging is a modifier for previous models of viewing. We need things like re-binging or unbinging or non-binged or de-binging. I don't know, de-binging could be a thing.
Post-binge.
Yeah, sorry.
Perhaps we'll even enter the post-binge era. Yeah, Tina, go ahead.
I was just going to add on to that, Kartik. There's a great, because you can think about that in relation as well to like the whole host of like social media that gets posted. And, obviously people's sense of like self and well-being is so tethered to like, the number of counts that they get, that like often people will like take down videos, like if they don't immediately get the number of counts that like they think a video deserves. But there's a great thing called petit tube, so like the French word petit tube, that's an algorithmic thing that takes the least viewed videos on YouTube and uses that to curate a feed, which I find so interesting in light of that unviewed YouTube video.
Yeah, that is great. I love that.
Well, that might be the right place to stop. That we'll end what you were apologizing for turning melancholic, Kartik, but now we can end with the completely abject, like the unwatched, the unviewed, and
but also hope.
Dig ourselves back out of that location, right? No, this has been wonderful. I really want to thank you all, and it's been a terrific audience. It's been as Patricia Zimmerman just posted, a stimulating field stretching webinar. I'll take that from you, Patty. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Mark.
Great questions. Thank you.
Yeah.